The scripture today comes from the book of Exodus 1 through 18. The whole Israelite community set out from Elim and came to the desert of Sin, which was between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had come out of Egypt. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, "If only we have died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into the desert to starve this entire assembly to death." Then the Lord said to Moses, "I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this way I will test them and see whether they will follow my instructions. On the 16th day they are to prepare what they bring in, and that is to be twice as much as what they gather on the other days." So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, "In the evening you will know that it is the Lord who brought you out of Egypt, and in the morning you will see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we that you should grumble against us?" Moses also said, "You will know that it was the Lord when he gives you meat to eat in the evening and all the bread you want in the morning, because he has heard your grumble against him. Who are we? You are not grumbling against us, but against the Lord." Then Moses told Aaron, "Say to the entire Israelite community, 'Come before the Lord, for he has heard your grumbling.'" While Aaron was speaking to the whole Israelite community, they looked toward the desert, and there was the glory of the Lord appearing in a cloud. The Lord said to Moses, "I have heard the grumbling of the Israelites. Tell them at twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you will be filled with bread. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God." That evening quail came and covered the camp, and in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the dew was gone, thin flakes of frost on the ground appeared on the desert floor. When the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, "What is it?" For they did not know what it was. Moses said to them, "It is the bread of the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Everyone is to gather as much as they need. Take an omer for each person you have in your tent." The Israelites did as they were told. Some gathered much, some little. And when they measured it by the omer, the one who had gathered much did not have too much, and the one who had gathered little did not have too little. Everyone had gathered just as much as they needed. Let's face it, sometimes it feels like we don't have enough. Like the Israelites, it might be not having enough food or enough money or enough time, maybe enough health. It might be some kind of thing that we physically don't have, an item or something that we just don't have enough of. It might be just not having enough patience or enough will to be able to continue on. There are days when we feel empty. We feel like we have nothing in the world and we are alone, broke, lost, and empty. That happens. It happens when we experience death around us or suffering or other hardships. It happens in the midst of trials when we feel disconnected from God. When we come into those seasons, and if we take that moment to be honest, oftentimes we're a little disappointed when we hear responses that are something like, "Just trust in God." Oh, I hadn't thought about that. Or, "Be thankful for what you do have. Don't focus on what you don't have." Just remember, God always has been and always will be faithful. Now, those are true pieces of advice. But I don't know in those moments that they're necessarily good pieces of advice. Because when we're in the midst of those trials, they aren't helpful necessarily. Sometimes, like the Israelites in our text today, we just want to grumble. As we dive into the scripture, it's important that we recognize some of the themes that we're picking up here. The Bible has a little bit of a thing for deserts. Whenever you see a desert, a bell should immediately light up in your head to say, "Oh, a trial is happening." Every time. Every time a desert is mentioned, something about wilderness, any of those kinds of things, your light bulb should light up and say, "Oh, somebody Their faithfulness is being challenged. Their reliance on God is being challenged. We see it as a theme that happens again and again and again in the Bible. Most notably, maybe we remember Jesus' 40 days and 40 nights in the desert without food or water. Boop. Jesus is being tested in his faithfulness to God. Every time we see that, that's where it's going. But for the Israelites, there's a really practical purpose of being in the desert. It's safe. It's a desert. It's kind of safe. Remember, they are fleeing from the Egyptians. And in the place in the world where this is taking place, there's a desert, and then there's a fertile crescent, is what it's called, that wraps clear around the desert, connecting Egypt to Israel. Most people, most roads, most armies traveled down that fertile strip. But Israel's not doing that. They're wandering straight into the middle of a desert. There are no armies to take them over. There's no way for the Egyptians to be able to catch up with them and destroy them because they couldn't support an army in the midst of the desert. It just isn't possible. Of course, that adds the challenge of supporting the army that is Israel traveling through the desert. As impractical as it is for the Egyptian army, it's maybe more so for the people who are traveling on foot, possibly, having escaped from slavery. The desert is a place of wild beasts, a place where you are either able to maintain your godly spirit, your humanity, that inbreathing of God's ruach, his breath, his presence, or like the wild beasts, you turn to just filling your own desires. That's the point of the desert. It's finding out if we are truly filled and truly connected with God's presence, or if we turn to our baser instincts. And so this is where the setting takes place, in the midst of this place of trial. And we see that Israel is starting to get hungry. And so they start to grumble. Now, remember, Israel has seen the plagues of Egypt. They've seen God convince Pharaoh to let the people go. We've seen God come down as a giant pillar of fire. We've seen God split the Red Sea and create dry land to walk across. We're following currently a pillar of fire to Mount Sinai. We've seen miracles at this point. We saw the story in just the last chapter, Exodus 15, where they came to the place where the water was bitter and it was miraculously transformed into the most delicious water they'd ever had. We see them arrive at a place where there are a dozen springs of water and 70 palm trees for them to camp under. 12 and 70, it's a thing. They've experienced the miraculous. And so it's really easy for us to fall into this place where we start to judge Israel. And we start to say, what is wrong with you people? Why aren't you trusting in God? But I think maybe we give them a little bit too much of a bad rap. I think we have to really imagine ourselves in their position. They've escaped from Egypt, and they are traveling through the desert. 600,000 people, 60,000 people traveling across the desert. And their food supplies are shrinking as the days go on. Of course, they took some food with them from Egypt. We're told that for the first week, they made the unleavened bread while they're in Egypt. They ate it for a week. On the seventh day, they had a feast. But that's been a couple months ago. A little bit ago, they camped at that little oasis. Maybe they were able to gather some supplies there, but enough to feed everyone? They've been wandering the desert for probably about 45 days at this point. And their stores are getting low. And they're looking at their children. And they're looking at their wives. They're looking at their neighbors. And they're starting to wonder, do we have enough? And fear starts to set in. They could die in the desert. There's a little bit of a joke that goes around that sees this reflection of, we had meat in Egypt. We could eat as much as we wanted, even in the midst of slavery. But at least there they knew they could eat. They knew that they could survive to the next day. A day of slavery, a day of possible beatings, a day of forced service, but not dying of hunger in the desert. When we really put ourselves in their shoes, I think that maybe, just maybe, Israel wasn't wrong to grumble. Maybe, just maybe, we can see a little bit of ourselves more than we want to admit there. And so as they're grumbling, as they are complaining against God, the word that's used for grumble is really interesting. It's only used a few times to mean complaining, like 4 times in the entire Bible. Everywhere else, it means to rest or to stay or to kind of set down, to continue in one place. I think what's happening here is this idea of like a donkey, right? Like when the donkey complains, it just sits on the ground and refuses to move. I imagine the pillar of fire is moving along, Moses and Aaron are moving along, and the entire Israelite community is just like, no, we are not going any further until we get something to eat. Until you can prove to us that you can feed us, we aren't going any further. So God says, look, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to send this manna. I'm going to send quail, and you will have more food than you know what to do with. You will have plenty. You will eat your fill. So let's look at the manna as it comes down. This idea of manna, man, is, what is it? Man, what is it? That's literally what it means. And so it's funny when they say they called it, what is it? Because they didn't know what it was. It appears every morning and it melts like the dew as the day goes on. The Bible describes it as being like coriander seeds, but white coriander seeds. And each person is to go out each day with some kind of interesting stuff happening on the Sabbath, but that's for a different sermon. They go out every day and they collect an omer of this stuff. They collect it into whatever they have, baskets, sacks, bowls, whatever they have. They're collecting this manna. And they're bringing it back to their tents. And they're collecting 1 omer per person. Every man, woman, and child is getting some of this manna. They grind it up. They turn it into bread. And everyone gets an entire omer every day. Now, that really doesn't mean anything to us, right? Okay, how much is an omer? Is that like a barrel, a bushel? We recently just went to go pick apples at the apple orchard, and they said, "Well, how much do you want? Do you want a half bushel or a whole bushel?" And I literally just kind of looked at them and said, "I have no idea what those numbers mean. I don't know what that measurement means." I think we get there with omer, right? An omer is about 9.5 cups. It's a fairly small measurement as far as like masses go, but it's about 9.5 cups. And so I want to break this down in the logic that the Bible is putting forward for us. Every day, everyone in the Israelite camp is going out and collecting for every man, woman, and child 9.5 cups of coriander seeds, give or take. That's about 1.5 pounds of coriander seeds. If it was coriander seeds, it's 2,200 calories worth of these little seeds that they're collecting each and every day, and then making it into bread, maybe with some olive oil, maybe with some other ingredients that they're able to collect. And they're making it into this bread that they're going to eat each and every day. 1.5 pounds of bread every day that they are eating. And then the quail come. The quail, if we look at Numbers 11, it gives us a little bit better of a picture if we're kind of judging these things together. They happen separate, so I want to be cautious doing that, but I think it's helpful to kind of get our heads around what's happening there. In the story of quail in Numbers 11, we are told that they are like 3 foot deep for a day's journey. There are millions and millions and millions of these birds everywhere. And if we have even a hint of that in this story in Exodus, people have plenty to eat. God surely has fulfilled his promise of saying they will eat their fill. My guidance today, my lesson that I'm drawing from this today is not go grumble to your leaders. Please don't do that. Just saying. And it isn't really put God's provision to question. That's not really what I'm saying either. It isn't looking at God and saying, God, can you really provide for me? It's not necessarily that. And it isn't necessarily saying, just trust in the Lord. God will provide. God has already provided. Look at what you have. That's not really where we're at either. Today, I'm less describing us in this story or the Israelites in this story. And I want us to understand something about God in this story. I hope to help us learn something about the character of God. As the Israelites, who God has chosen as God's people, continue to grumble and complain and show their distrust, God responds with an outpouring of blessing. And I think what's happening here in this passage is not that God is providing for their needs. God is doing that. But I think what's happening in this passage is that God is providing for their needs in a way that is absolutely ridiculous. I think what's happening in this passage is that for a native reader, somebody who read the Bible when it was written for them, they would have looked at this and they said, an omer of manna? What in the... You'd be so full. And quail? Where do they keep this food at? It's this idea that when we complain that we don't have enough, God pours out in such an extreme measure that it becomes miraculous in and of itself. That the only way we can understand that blessing is by understanding it as having come from God. In the story of the manna and the quail, God responds to groaning in an almost sarcastic graciousness. When God's power is challenged, we see in the Psalms, they reflect on this occasion. And it says that the Israelites challenged God and said, can God really lay a table before us in the desert? And God says, oh, you want a table? You want a meal? Here is a feast. I once heard a tradition that described the sarcastic nature of what's happening in this story. The way that it was described is that a person who was sitting maybe leaning against a tree or just standing out in a field as the manna started to fall could hold out their hand and in an instant would have collected an entire omer. Not that you could hold 9.5 cups of coriander seeds in your palm of your hand, but yeah. But you could stand out and just hold out your hand and you have been provided the entire day worth of food. That God was providing in such abundance that in an instant, you were completely and totally satiated. I think about the story, and it's the header quote on our bulletin this week. It's the song from Barney and Friends. You know, if all the raindrops were lemon drops and gumdrops. This idea of food falling from the sky. And the people looking at it and going, what in the world is happening here? Maybe today Maybe in this season, you feel like grumbling. Maybe you've gone to others and you've said, I'm just unhappy. I'm angry at God. I'm not trusting in God in the way that I have. I'm not sure that I can trust in God. Maybe that's where you're at right now. I want to tell you that our God responds to that challenge. I want to tell you that our God responds to our doubts, not with hatred, not with condemnation, but instead, God responds through an outpouring of blessing. I want to call you to a time of prayer this week. I want to challenge you to be in conversation with God. And maybe you are one who simply prays a daily prayer with a commentary or like a upper room or something like that. Maybe you have a daily passage or prayer group you're in. But this week, I want to challenge you to dive into real prayer. I want you to have a conversation with God. And if this week it is grumbling, grumble away. If this week it is praising God, praise. But whatever it is, know that when we come before God, whether it be with a grumbling spirit, whether it be with a joyful spirit, whatever we do, whenever we come before God, God responds by outpouring his blessing. In the beginning of the sermon, I mentioned that oftentimes when we talk about how unhappy we are or how we are feeling challenged to trust God, that oftentimes we are kind of dismissed. No worry, God's got this. Everything happens for a reason. I want to challenge you to imagine what a church would look like when we were free to grumble. When our concerns and our fears were answered not with a dismissive pushback, but instead when we really heard those grumblings of our friends and our neighbors, our fellow Christians, those who are part of our church and those who aren't part of our church. I want to challenge you to imagine what a church that listened to those grumblings would look like. I think maybe, just maybe, the church itself would become manna. That the church itself would become a place where God's blessings poured out in ridiculous amounts. A church that hears the groanings of its community, that hears and looks for those areas that people are expressing pain. It's that kind of church. It's that kind of Christian that is able to effectively respond and effectively be a source of God's outpouring of sustenance, an outpouring of God's grace, of God's love, and the gospel of Jesus Christ. Go and groan, church. Go and praise. Go and be a source of blessing. May be true in your life and in mine.